You've heard of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You've probably seen them on a poster. Maybe a therapist walked you through them. Maybe you looked them up after losing someone and tried to figure out which stage you were in. Here's what nobody told you. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the psychiatrist who wrote those 5 stages, spent the last years of her life watching people misuse her work, and she said so publicly. The model was never designed as a roadmap for grief. It was a description of how terminally ill patients responded to their own impending death. Not bereavement, not loss, their own death. Somewhere between 1969 and now, self-help turned it into a universal checklist. Grief counselors built entire practices around it, and people who didn't move through the stages in order were quietly made to feel like they were grieving wrong. That's not psychology. That's mythology with a citation. So let's talk about what grief actually looks like. 7 levels, built from decades of research that never made it onto anyone's poster. Level 1. Shock. This is the first thing that happens, and the thing the 5-stage model almost completely ignores. When a significant loss hits, the brain doesn't immediately process it as real. There's a neurological shutdown. Heart rate drops, perception narrows, time distorts. Researchers call it peritraumatic dissociation. Your body treats catastrophic news the way it treats physical trauma, by blunting it. This isn't denial in the pop psychology sense. You're not refusing to accept reality. Your nervous system is buying time. The difference matters because treating shock like a psychological defense you need to move through makes people feel broken for being numb when they should apparently be crying. Level 2. Protest. Anger is too small a word for what happens here. The protest response is biological. When an attachment bond breaks, through death, through abandonment, through sudden loss, the brain generates a distress signal that functions like physical pain. John Bowlby documented this in his attachment research. The organism doesn't accept the loss quietly. It fights the reality of it. This is why people rage at doctors, at God, at themselves, at the person who died. It's not irrational. It's the nervous system refusing to update its model of the world. The 5-stage framework treats anger as a phase to pass through. Bowlby's research says it's more fundamental than that. For some people, the protest never fully ends. It just changes shape. Level 3. Searching. This one barely exists in popular grief culture, which is strange because it's one of the most universal grief experiences documented in the literature. After a significant loss, people search. They look for the person who died in crowds. They reach for their phone to call someone who isn't there anymore. They smell their clothing. They go back to places they used to go together. Cognitive scientists describe this as the brain still running a prediction model that includes the lost person and repeatedly generating errors. It isn't crazy. It's the lag between what the brain expects and what reality delivers. Some researchers think this searching phase is what drives much of what we mislabel as depression in grief. Level 4. Despair. This is the closest thing to what the 5-stage model calls depression, but the distinction matters. Grief despair is not a clinical depressive episode. The neurochemistry overlaps, but the trajectory is different. Depression tends to flatten. Everything loses meaning equally, including things unrelated to the loss. Grief despair is specific. It keeps returning to the absence of the person. It has content. Treating grief despair with antidepressants is a real clinical debate. Some researchers argue it short-circuits a necessary process. Others argue prolonged despair is its own harm. What's not in debate is that calling it depression and routing people toward the same interventions erases a meaningful distinction, one that affects how people understand their own experience. Level 5. Disorganization. Nobody talks about this one. After a significant loss, identity can destabilize in ways that have nothing to do with sadness. People don't know how to introduce themselves anymore. Roles disappear. The internal story someone was telling about their life stops making sense. A widow who built her daily structure around a partner doesn't just grieve the person. She loses the architecture of her day, her future plans, her sense of what comes next. Psychologists call this assumptive world disruption. The background assumptions that make life feel coherent collapse. This is why grief can look like confusion, purposelessness, or personality change, and why well-meaning people telling someone to stay busy or get back to normal are often asking them to return to a normal that no longer exists.
Level 6. Reorganization. This is where real recovery starts, and it looks nothing like the 5-stage model's acceptance. Reorganization isn't making peace with the loss. It's rebuilding a functional identity and life structure around it. The loss doesn't shrink. The person grows around it. George Bonanno at Columbia has spent 2 decades studying this, and his data consistently shows that most people reorganize without professional intervention, at highly variable speeds, and often without moving through any recognizable sequence of stages. His research also found something that cuts against almost everything in popular grief culture. Resilience after loss is common. About 35 to 65% of people show minimal functional disruption. That's not suppression. Their grief is real. They just don't fall apart, and they shouldn't feel guilty for it. Level 7. Integration. This is the level the self-help industry doesn't sell because it doesn't feel like an ending. Integration means the loss becomes part of who you are, without dominating it. Not closure, not moving on. The research on continuing bonds, a framework developed by Klass, Silverman, and Nickman, found that maintaining an ongoing internal relationship with the person who died is not pathological. It's normal. For many people, it's healthy. The whole Western grief framework is built around detachment as the goal. Cut the bond, move forward, accept the absence. But cross-cultural grief research doesn't support that as universal, and longitudinal studies of bereaved individuals show that people who maintain a symbolic connection often function as well or better long-term than those who try to sever it. The 5 stages aren't useless. They name some real experiences. But when a model designed for dying patients gets applied to every human loss in every culture at every age, it stops being a clinical tool and becomes something else. It becomes a standard people try to meet, a sequence they feel behind on, a reason to wonder if they're grieving wrong.